"Get out of my sight, you worthless piece of garbage!" my mother screamed, her face twisted with the kind of rage I'd grown accustomed to over the years. The crystal wine glass in her hand trembled as she pointed it at me like a weapon. "You think you can just waltz in here and embarrass me in front of the Hendersons? You're nothing but a disappointment." I stood there in the marble foyer of our Charlotte mansion, my designer dress torn at the shoulder from where she'd grabbed me moments earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being called worthless in a house that technically belonged to me, by a woman who had no idea her entire lifestyle hung by a thread I controlled. My name is Caroline Moore, and I'm 27 years old. For most people, that might seem young to be managing a $100 million family trust. But grandfather had always seen something in me that my mother, Vivian, refused to acknowledge. Tonight's explosion had started over something trivial. I'd corrected her when she told the Hendersons that our family had built Brightmere Industries from scratch. The truth was, we'd inherited it, but Mother never let facts get in the way of her grand narratives. "I worked my entire life to build this family's reputation," she continued, her voice echoing off the imported Italian marble. "And you destroyed it in 5 minutes with your smart mouth." Behind her, my stepfather Gregory nodded along like the spineless yes man he'd always been. He'd married into our wealth 3 years ago, and ever since, he'd been Mother's perfect accomplice in maintaining the illusion that they were self-made moguls. Their matching Rolex watches caught the light from the chandelier, gifts they'd bought themselves with money from the trust I managed. What they didn't know was that tonight's dinner party hadn't gone as badly as Mother thought. In fact, it had gone exactly as I'd planned. Dr. Henderson wasn't just a family friend. He was also the trustee who'd been waiting for the right moment to implement the provisions grandfather had put in place. The ones that would activate if Mother ever crossed certain lines. "You know what your problem is, Caroline?" Mother stepped closer, and I could smell the expensive French perfume that masked the scent of her third bottle of wine. "You think you're better than everyone else. But you're just a spoiled little girl who's never had to work for anything." I almost laughed at the irony. Instead, I just smiled, which only made her angrier. The storm building behind her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Tonight was going to be the night that changed everything. Growing up in the Moore family meant living with secrets wrapped in silk and buried under money. My grandfather, Thomas Moore, had built our fortune through smart investments and careful planning, but more importantly, he'd been wise enough to see through my mother's facade long before I was old enough to understand it myself. I remembered the day he'd pulled me aside in his study when I was 16. The walls were lined with leather-bound books and family photos, but his expression had been unusually serious as he explained the trust structure he'd created. "Caroline, your mother is a beautiful woman, but she lacks the judgment needed to preserve what our family has built," he'd said quietly, his weathered hands folding over mine. "That's why I'm placing you in control of the trust when you turn 25. But until then, this stays between us." He'd made me promise to let Mother believe she held the purse strings, to avoid confrontation until I was mature enough to handle the responsibility. For the past 2 years since taking control, I'd honored that promise, watching silently as she threw lavish parties, bought expensive cars, and redecorated the house every season, all while believing she was spending her own money. The arrangement had worked well enough until Gregory entered the picture. Where Mother was simply vain and materialistic, Gregory was calculating and greedy. I'd watched him encourage her worst impulses, pushing her to spend more, to show off more, to assert her dominance over everyone around her, including me. Their relationship had shifted the dynamics in our house dramatically. Mother had always been critical, but Gregory's presence had amplified her cruelty tenfold. He whispered in her ear about how I was trying to undermine her authority, how I needed to be put in my place. What he didn't realize was that every cruel word, every manipulation, was being carefully documented. Dr. Henderson, grandfather's oldest friend and the backup trustee, had been visiting more frequently lately. Officially, he came for dinner parties and social calls. Unofficially, He'd been gathering evidence of Mother's increasingly erratic behavior and Gregory's influence over the family finances. Grandfather's will had included specific provisions about mental competency and undue influence, safeguards he'd put in place to protect the family legacy. Tonight's dinner had been the final test. I'd deliberately brought up family history, knowing Mother would embellish and lie in front of witnesses. Dr. Henderson had watched it all unfold with the careful attention of someone building a legal case. As I stood in the foyer now, facing Mother's rage, I could see Gregory hanging back by the staircase, his phone in his hand. He'd been making increasingly desperate calls to his gambling contacts lately, unaware that I'd been monitoring the trust's expenses. The pieces were all in place. "You know what, Caroline? I've had enough of your attitude." Mother's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper, the kind that usually preceded her most vicious attacks. "Maybe it's time you learned some respect." She stepped closer, and I could see the calculation in her eyes. This wasn't just anger anymore. This was deliberate. Gregory had moved closer too, positioning himself where he could block any escape route to the front door. They'd clearly planned this confrontation, thinking they could intimidate me into submission. "Vivian, maybe we should all just calm down." Dr. Henderson's voice came from behind me. He'd emerged from the dining room where he'd been saying goodbye to the other guests, his medical bag in hand, and his expression carefully neutral. "It's been a long evening for everyone. Dr. Henderson, this is a family matter." Gregory interjected smoothly, his voice carrying a threat I'd learned to recognize. "I'm sure you understand." But Dr. Henderson didn't leave. Instead, he positioned himself near the archway, close enough to witness whatever was about to unfold, but far enough away to avoid being directly involved. His presence was both comforting and strategic, exactly what Grandfather would have wanted. "You think you're so smart," Mother continued, her attention fixed entirely on me now. "Always correcting me, always acting like you know better. Well, let me tell you something, little girl. I brought you into this world, and I can take you out of it." The threat hung in the air like poison. I'd heard variations of it my entire life, but tonight felt different. Tonight, there was a finality to her words that made my skin crawl. "Mother, you're drunk," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Maybe you should go to bed and we can discuss this tomorrow." "Don't you dare dismiss me." She was shouting now, loud enough that the remaining guests in the dining room would definitely hear. "I am your mother. I own this house. I control everything in your pathetic little life." That's when I made my mistake. I laughed. Not cruelly, but with genuine amusement at the irony of her statement. The sound seemed to snap something inside her, and I watched her face transform from anger into something much more dangerous. "You think this is funny?" Her voice had gone deadly quiet again. "You think you can laugh at me in my own home?" She was moving toward me now, and I could see Gregory tensing behind her, ready to support whatever she was planning to do. The chandelier cast long shadows across the marble floor, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely afraid of my own mother. Dr. Henderson cleared his throat softly, his presence a reminder that witnesses were still in the house. But Mother was beyond caring about appearances now. "Let me show you exactly how funny this is," she snarled, and I knew the moment had finally come. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Mother lunged forward with surprising speed for someone who'd consumed 3 bottles of wine, her manicured hands grabbing my shoulders and shoving me backward with vicious force. I stumbled, my heels catching on the Persian rug, and felt myself falling toward the sliding glass doors that led to the garden terrace. Time seemed to slow as I realized what was about to happen. The doors were closed, and I was moving too fast to stop myself. The impact was devastating. The glass exploded around me in a shower of glittering fragments, each piece catching the light like deadly diamonds as they rained down. I felt the sharp edges slice through my dress, my arms, my face, as I crashed through the door and landed hard on the stone terrace beyond. For a moment, Everything was silent except for the tinkling sound of glass settling on the ground around me. Then the pain hit. Burning lines of fire across my arms and back where the glass had found its mark. Blood began to pool beneath me, dark against the pale stone. "Oh my God," I heard Dr. Henderson's voice from somewhere far away. "Vivian, what have you done?" But it was Gregory's voice that cut through the haze of pain and shock. "She fell," he said quickly, his tone smooth and practiced. "She was drunk, and she fell through the door. We all saw it." I tried to push myself up, feeling glass embed deeper into my palms as I pressed against the ground. When I finally managed to look back through the shattered doorway, I saw Mother standing there with her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with what might have been shock or satisfaction. I couldn't tell which. "Caroline." Dr. Henderson was beside me now, his medical training kicking in as he knelt to assess my injuries. "Don't move, dear. Let me look at these cuts." As he began examining the wounds on my arms, carefully picking out pieces of glass, I heard Mother's voice from inside the house. She was already spinning the story, telling the remaining guests that I'd had too much to drink and accidentally fallen through the door. Gregory was backing up her version, describing how they'd tried to catch me but couldn't reach me in time. "We should call an ambulance," Dr. Henderson said quietly, his voice meant only for me. "No," I whispered back, surprised by how calm I sounded despite the blood and pain. "No ambulance. Just clean me up, please." He looked at me strangely, but nodded, understanding that there was more to this situation than met the eye. As he worked to bandage my wounds with supplies from his medical bag, I heard Mother dismissing the other guests, her voice bright and social, as she assured them that everything was under control. When the last guest had left and the house fell quiet, Mother finally came to check on me. She stood in the doorway, careful not to step on the broken glass, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I hope you've learned your lesson," she said coldly, as if I'd simply been sent to my room instead of thrown through a window. "Actions have consequences, Caroline. Remember that." But as I looked up at her through the blood running down my face, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury that reminded me exactly whose granddaughter I was. "Yes," I said quietly, my voice steady despite everything. "They certainly do." Dr. Henderson helped me into the guest bathroom downstairs, away from Mother and Gregory's prying eyes. As he cleaned my wounds more thoroughly, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, and almost didn't recognize the person looking back. My dress was torn and bloody, my hair matted with glass fragments, and thin lines of cuts crisscrossed my arms like a roadmap of violence. "Caroline," Dr. Henderson said quietly as he applied antiseptic to a particularly deep cut on my forearm. "What really happened out there?" I met his eyes in the mirror. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, even if I hadn't known it at the time. "You saw what happened, Dr. Henderson." My mother shoved me through a glass door. He nodded slowly, his expression grave. "Yes, I did see that, and I suspect I'm not the only one who will see it clearly." That's when I noticed the small recording device he'd discreetly placed on the bathroom counter, the same device Grandfather had given him years ago for documenting family meetings. Everything that had happened tonight had been captured, from Mother's drunken ranting to the actual assault. "Your grandfather was a wise man," Dr. Henderson continued, wrapping gauze around my arm. "He suspected this day might come." "How long have you been recording?" I asked. 3 months. Ever since Gregory started encouraging your mother to increase her spending and make those threats about changing your grandfather's will." He secured the bandage with medical tape. "We have everything, Caroline. The financial manipulation, the emotional abuse, and now this." As he spoke, I felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The conversations I'd overheard between Mother and Gregory about putting me in my place. The increasingly expensive purchases they'd been making without consulting me. the lawyers they'd been meeting with to explore options for breaking the trust. "They've been planning something," I said, more to myself than to him. "More than planning. Gregory's been feeding your mother information about trust law, convincing her that she can have you declared incompetent and take control of the finances herself." Dr. Henderson packed his medical supplies back into his bag. "What they don't realize is that your grandfather anticipated this exact scenario." He pulled out his phone and showed me a series of documents he'd photographed earlier in the evening. Legal papers that Gregory had left carelessly on the hall table, detailing their scheme to have me committed for erratic behavior and financial incompetence. "The irony," I said, feeling a cold smile spread across my face despite the pain, "is that they just provided all the evidence we need to prove their own incompetence." Dr. Henderson nodded. "Assault, financial manipulation, conspiracy to commit fraud. Your grandfather's contingency plans cover all of this. The backup trustees are already on standby." We could hear Mother and Gregory in the kitchen, their voices rising as they argued about how to handle the Caroline situation. Gregory was pushing for immediate action, suggesting they move forward with their commitment plan before I could cause more trouble. Mother was hesitating, perhaps finally realizing the gravity of what she'd done. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we activate Protocol 7, Dr. Henderson said, referencing the code name Grandfather had given to his most extreme contingency plan. "By morning, the secondary trust provisions will be in effect. All accounts will be frozen pending investigation, and your mother and Gregory will find themselves without access to any family funds." As if summoned by our conversation, Gregory appeared in the bathroom doorway, his face flushed with anger, and something that might have been panic. "What are you two whispering about in here?" he demanded. I looked at him through the mirror, my reflection now cleaned up and bandaged but still bearing the evidence of what they'd done. "Just discussing the consequences of actions, Gregory. You should understand that concept." Gregory's eyes narrowed as he stepped into the bathroom, his presence immediately making the small space feel claustrophobic. "You need to be very careful about what you say next, Caroline. Your mother is extremely upset, and making accusations isn't going to help anyone." "Accusations?" I turned to face him directly, ignoring the pain that shot through my bandaged arms with the movement. "Is that what we're calling evidence now?" Dr. Henderson stepped slightly between us, his body language protective but professional. "Mr. Wallace, perhaps you should give Caroline some space to recover from her injuries." "Her injuries from falling through a door," Gregory said pointedly, his voice carrying a clear warning, "which multiple witnesses can confirm." That's when I realized just how far they'd planned to take this. The story was already set, the witnesses coached, the narrative established. In their minds, I was just another obstacle to be managed, another problem to be solved through manipulation and intimidation. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated exactly how much I knew about their activities. "Gregory," I said, my voice steady and calm, "do you remember that dinner party we had last month? The one where you spent the entire evening on your phone, making calls to someone named Vincent about your gambling debts?" His face went pale, confirming what I'd suspected for weeks. "I don't know what you're talking about." $50,000, I continued, watching his expression crumble. "That's how much you owe, isn't it? And that's why you've been pushing Mother to increase her monthly allowance from the trust. Not for her shopping, but to cover your losses at the casino." Dr. Henderson was watching this exchange with interest, his hand resting casually on his phone, where I knew he was still recording everything. "You've been funding your gambling addiction with family money," I said, taking a step closer to Gregory. "Money that doesn't actually belong to my mother, no matter what you've convinced her to believe." "You can't prove any of that," Gregory said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can." I smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was genuine. "Every transaction from the trust is documented, every payment, every transfer, every expense, including the $50,000 that was withdrawn last month and mysteriously never appeared in any of Mother's accounts." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of Mother's heels clicking on the marble floor as she approached the bathroom. When she appeared in the doorway behind Gregory, her face was flushed and her hands were shaking. Whether from anger or alcohol, I couldn't tell. "What's taking so long in here?" she demanded. "Gregory, I thought you were going to handle this situation." "I am handling it," he said, but his eyes never left mine. "Caroline was just telling us about some interesting theories she has about family finances." Mother's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. "What kind of theories?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when their carefully constructed world would begin to collapse around them. I looked from Mother to Gregory, seeing the fear beginning to creep into their eyes as they realized that their victim might not be as helpless as they'd assumed. "The kind of theories," I said quietly, "that are about to become very public knowledge." Before either of them could respond, Dr. Henderson's phone began to ring. He glanced at the screen and then at me, a slight nod confirming what I already knew. The backup trustees had been activated. Protocol 7 was now in motion, and in just a few hours, everything my mother and Gregory thought they controlled would be gone. The phone call lasted exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. I knew because I watched every second tick by on the bathroom clock as Dr. Henderson spoke in low, professional tones to someone on the other end. Mother and Gregory stood frozen in the doorway, their faces growing paler with each passing moment. "Yes, the documentation is complete," Dr. Henderson said into the phone. "Physical evidence of assault, recorded threats, financial impropriety, and clear evidence of undue influence." He paused, listening. "No, she's stable. Minor lacerations, but nothing requiring hospitalization." When he hung up, the silence in the bathroom was deafening. "Who was that?" Mother's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The backup trustees," I answered for him, my voice remarkably steady considering the magnitude of what was happening. "They've been on standby for months, waiting for exactly this situation." Gregory tried to push past Dr. Henderson, his face twisted with desperate anger. "You can't do this. Vivian has rights. She's Caroline's mother, for God's sake. She's also someone who just committed felony assault while under the influence," Dr. Henderson replied calmly. "And you're someone who's been embezzling from a family trust to pay gambling debts. Neither of those positions offers much legal protection." I watched Mother's face as the reality began to sink in. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her perfectly applied makeup now streaked with sweat and tears. She hadn't even realized she was crying. "Caroline," she said, her voice breaking, "you can't mean to do this. I'm your mother. After everything I've done for you. After everything you've done to me," I corrected. "There's a difference, Mother. And after tonight, everyone will know exactly what that difference is." The sound of cars pulling into our circular driveway drifted through the broken glass door. The cavalry had arrived. What followed was the most methodical destruction of a life I'd ever witnessed. The backup trustees arrived first, 3 lawyers in dark suits who moved through our house like surgical instruments, photographing evidence, documenting the scene, and quietly taking inventory of everything Mother and Gregory had considered theirs. The police came next, called by Dr. Henderson to document the assault. They took photos of my injuries, collected samples of blood from the broken glass, and recorded statements from all parties involved. Throughout it all, Mother kept insisting it had been an accident, that I'd fallen, that she'd never meant for anyone to get hurt. But the recording device had captured everything, and Dr. Henderson's testimony as a medical professional carried significant weight. By 3 a.m., Gregory was being led away in handcuffs on charges of embezzlement and conspiracy, while Mother was served with a restraining order that barred her from the house pending a competency hearing. "This is temporary," she kept saying as she packed a suitcase under the watchful eyes of the trustees. "This is all just a misunderstanding. Caroline, tell them this is a misunderstanding." I stood in the doorway of her bedroom, still wearing my torn and bloodied dress, watching her frantically stuff designer clothes into Louis Vuitton luggage. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every item she was packing had been purchased with money she'd never actually controlled. "Where will you go?" I asked, surprising myself with how little emotion I felt. "Hotel, I suppose, until we can get this sorted out." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret. "Caroline, you can't really mean to go through with this. We're family." "Family," I repeated, touching the bandage on my cheek. "Right." By dawn, the house was quiet again, and for the first time in my life, it truly felt like home. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of that night rippled through Mother and Gregory's lives like an earthquake. Gregory's gambling debts caught up with him in jail, where he discovered that losing family money was far less forgiving than losing his own. Mother found herself living in a modest apartment across town, working as a receptionist at a medical office, her first real job in 30 years. The competency hearing stripped her of any claim to the family trust, and the restraining order ensured she could never again set foot in the house where she'd once ruled like a tyrant. Their social circle, built on wealth and appearances, evaporated overnight when the money disappeared. As I sat in Grandfather's study 6 months later, reviewing the quarterly trust reports, I reflected on the path that had brought me here. The scars on my arms had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But they served as daily reminders of the night everything changed. I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about revealing who they really are beneath the masks they wear. The empire Mother thought she ruled had always been an illusion, and in the end, her own cruelty had been the key that unlocked her downfall.